couldn't find my lipstick this morning because I haven't worn it in years.
Right, exactly. And you moved. Hello, I'm Fen Huang, Director of Foster Gallery. And with me is Cameron Ann Mason, whose exhibition opened this week and runs through December 24th. Cameron is a textile artist. She's been with the Foster Whites since 2010. She's also exhibited throughout the Northwest, including the Bainbridge Island Museum of, Bainbridge Island Museum of Art, and as far afield as Rio de Janeiro in Brazil at the Patchwork Design Show, where she won an Audience Choice Award. Cameron has been a teaching artist both at Pratt Fine Arts as well as at the University of Washington in the School of Art. Cameron, welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you for being here with us today.
My pleasure.
Yeah. So it's been a momentous year. You've moved home and studio, and I understand it has changed your approach to your own work. How has it done that? Is it more about COVID, or is it more about a change of practice?
Well, it's really both. I would say that we knew that we were going to be moving. We'd been actively looking for a house and moved almost exactly a year ago right now. And so knew that that big change was coming. And I really knew that I wanted this show to be about home, even as soon as we scheduled it, which was before we moved. And I wanted to talk about not only home in the sense of where we live and the structures we live in, but also our home in the greater world. Our home specifically here in the Pacific Northwest on these lands. And so a lot of the work that's in this show is really based very specifically on the land that I'm living in our new home. By using plants that grow on the land that we're living on. And it really feels like that sense of home is imbuing this body of work in not only this idea of the place that we live, but also that we have been so confined to our homes during the pandemic, and has given us a chance to really sink in to that place, instead of going out to a studio, my studio's at home.
Right.
And so watching really the seasons change, the light on the water, because we do have a beautiful view of the Puget Sound and the Olympic Mountains where we're living now. And just seeing the sky change from sometimes minute to minute, watching storms roll in and out. It's very dramatic, and we jokingly call it Sky TV that we watch.
Nothing wrong with Sky TV.
So that it really is very much rooted in a specific place that I live, but also in this idea of where we feel protected, and safety within a really difficult time.
Sure. So the plants that you have been focusing on have tended to be ferns, but then also Himalayan blackberry.
Mm-hmm.
So something that's native to our lands here in the Pacific Northwest, and then others that are invasive, though maybe pervasive.
Yes.
We're so familiar with the Himalayan blackberry. What in those two plants has drawn your attention?
Well, there's 3 plants that I work mostly with, which is the ferns and the blackberry, but also the cedar. And there's actually bark ferns, which, looking at those plants, which are native to this land before we arrived, and then also contrasting that with the blackberry, which is the invasive species and really hard, as you mentioned, to get rid of. We do have that growing in our property, and it's such a interesting and complicated plant, the blackberry specifically, because it is it would take over if left alone. I sort of wonder if we all disappeared, it would be nothing but blackberry and rats, around here. But it also has its beauty,
Sure.
and it grows thorns but also berries.
So there's a
And
comfort to it.
There is. And I
Yeah.
was thinking about this specifically, about how we have this really, like, I don't know about you, but I grew up, picking blackberries and eating
Yes,
them, and that whole feel of, like, that memory, that sense memory of being a child, of eating berries and picking them, but being pricked by the thorns, and how that really puts you in a specific sense memory of all that smell and that feel and that taste. We're experiencing that on so many different with so many different of our senses.
Yes.
And also, but then when I'm printing with these blackberries, I'm looking at this incredibly common thing. Same with the ferns and the cedar. We're really surrounded by them so much that we don't even see them. But what I've done here is create this very specific imprint of them. We may see a sea of blackberry vines on a hillside, but if I cut that particular blackberry and that particular leaf, it adds this kind of way of seeing and specificity to that experience with that plant. So
like a pressed flower, or
well, like a pressed flower, except it's not the actual object. It's a print of the object. So it becomes a memory in itself.
Sure.
So it's not the actual object, but a memory of that object.
Right. I should invite the audience to send us questions. We are very happy to incorporate them into our conversation. And then past our conversation, Cameron will be spending some time exploring the techniques that she has used for the work in the exhibition. So it would be appropriate to add those questions at that time as well. Anyway.
Perfect.
Thanks. Well, further to the plants, though,
Mm-hmm.
there are new explorations that have been initiated in your new home and
Yes.
studio,
Mm-hmm.
and those are really important to this exhibition. Tell us a little about that.
Well, I think that it's this, getting back to that sense of what we're surrounded by and seeing it in a new way. In one of the pieces, or a number of the pieces, I'm taking prints from blackberry, from ferns, but also from stumps and from cedar. And the idea of those trees, we have these big, beautiful cedar trees in front of our house that are probably 80 to 100 years old, but they've been topped.
Right.
For view protection. So where we live, it has a homeowners association rules.
Yes.
And, those rules not only control how high your trees can go, but they did have restrictive covenants originally of who could live there.
Oh, right.
People of color were not allowed to buy houses there. They were not allowed to live there unless they were employed by the family that owned the house.
Sure.
So, that kind of limiting our experience, at the same time that like the trees are topped, these beautiful trees have been stopped, it gets back to some of these ideas I have about documenting nature and the effect of humans on it. so that we are living with the land, we're living on the land, but we're also affecting the land. And so that is another part of of the body of work for me. It's not just looking at nature, but looking at how we're affecting nature.
So I guess that ties in easily to a lot of the universal conversation that we've been experiencing in the year 2020.
Yeah.
And all of us having to be contemplative. There's like a forced quiet that comes with being home, but then also making considerations for the important issues of today.
For sure.
Right.
And it's been a time of, I think, deep reflection for most of us.
Sure.
Somewhat enforced, and so much is happening in the world right now that I've really been doing some really hard thinking about
Sure.
how I live in the world and how I can do a better job of that. I think most of us have.
So that might be quietly in the background of the making for these pieces, but then it feels to me as if it's also maybe an encapsulation or a capturing of memory and joy. So it's like maybe joy of discovery of your home, of the new techniques that you have been exploring, some of the new materials that are at your hand, rather. So maybe would you branch into some of that, literally, maybe the cedar or
Talking
your ice
about
dyeing and that kind of thing.
Yeah, sure. I can talk about techniques if you want to move into that.
Oh, maybe not the full on, but just that I'd like to know a little more of how you found yourself on this path. Where did it come from? Is it something that you were introduced to, or was it a happy circumstance that you should find yourself with some of these new dyeing techniques?
Yeah, I think that, kind of some of the silver linings of this time have been that having more time. I've jokingly said it's amazing how much you can get done if you have no social life,
Right.
which is really true. I've had a lot of time in the studio, and I've been able to really sink into. You mentioned the ice dyeing, and that's a new technique for me, and I've seen it. I keep track of what's going on. It's especially with fibers and textiles and dyeing, because that's my passion and what I do. So I've been reading about ice dyeing, and I just never hadn't really thought about doing it. I just thought it's not for me. But I found myself with this time, and I thought, well, I'm just going to try it out. So it was kind of a voyage of discovery for me to be able and to have the time. I think you were at my house, Fan, and saw my book of all my samples.
Lovely.
Yeah, so I didn't bring it today, but
Sure.
I went through, and I'm very process driven in my work, and I'm very interested in. I do a lot of record keeping, and so ice dyeing is basically a way of dyeing that instead of taking the dyes and dissolving them in a liquid or a chemical bath and then applying them to the fabric, you're actually using ice to retard the reactions of those dyes on the fabrics and as a carrier. So I have the fabrics, and I've generally manipulated them by folding or some other ways, manipulating them so that the pattern.
Sure.
And then I put ice on top of that, and then I'm just sprinkling the powdered dye on top of that and allowing time to carry, and the melting of the ice to carry that dye color through into the fabric. What that does is it allows, the dye colors that I get that I buy from the manufacturer are specific mixtures. There's no one green chemical dye or one black chemical dye. They're all mixtures of primary colors or the
So they're not
equivalent.
homogeneous.
They're not homogeneous.
Little
Exactly.
maybe crystals or groupings.
Right, exactly. They're
of-
mixtures of different powders that create different colors to create, just like a painter would mix a blue and a yellow to make a green. The dye manufacturers are doing the same thing.
and this is pre-mixed.
And it's
in
pre-mixed.
Some ways.
Some people
Yeah.
can mix their own, but I buy them pre-mixed.
Mhm.
So each one of those, when with the using the ice, it retards and slows down that process. And so those colors will split out into
The percentages that come in.
Exactly.
So if it were a third yellow and 40% green, but then the rest is blue, you're going to have in the dispersion of color
exactly.
as but then slightly melding.
Exactly. So
Right.
in some places the colors will blend, and in some places they may separate.
Sure.
And it creates these, like, especially when dealing with folding and the piece that's right behind you and the piece behind me, where I folded that, it creates this almost tiled or mosaic effect. But the colors they are literally changing through time as that ice is melting and bringing that dye powder down through the fabric. Instead of having a reaction happening right away, it's taking that time to do that, and they're separating out.
And much less homogeneous. And
Much less homogeneous.
Lovely sort of happy circumstance.
They
that
almost have a psychedelic feel, or
well, there's that too.
there's
Sure.
Yeah.
So here, then the dyes, I guess, the one dye, the mixture is made up of some sorts of blue and yellow towards orange,
Right.
and maybe even something else that creates that lovely depth,
Right.
the darkness in there.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So it's easier to see how those dyes are created by breaking them apart.
And does that mean then that some colors are more soluble and others less so, which changes the way that they wick into the fabric?
Yes, it's not so much the solubility, it's more the reaction time.
Mm.
So there are some colors, and without getting too far into chemistry
Right.
here,
Pardon
but
me.
there are some colors that what they call strike faster, and those tend to be the reds and yellows. So those will strike, and if I have a pile of fabric, the stuff that's at the top will have more brighter reds and oranges and yellows because those colors are hitting right away, but the blues are always the slowest to react in the dyes. And so at that bottom of the stack, you may see more of the separate, stronger blues.
So is that literally what's happened here then?
That's literally what's happening there.
Oh,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So is that what brought you to fabric in the first place?
It's so exciting.
Yeah.
I mean, every time I open up something that I've done, because sometimes when I'm doing processes like printing, it's kind of what you see is what you get.
Mm-hmm.
But something like a folded up or bound, or I'll fold it up, it'll be white, and I'll put dye on it at night, and I come out the next day, and it's always like Christmas.
Sure.
When I'm opening up those pieces and revealing what's there, I have some good ideas of what that's going to be, but I never know exactly what it is.
Right.
And so that is continually rewarding me. I guess that to me, the reward is in the making, in the revealing of that, talking about a particular three-dimensional piece, and actually this one here, and how the a line echoes a line of color in the dyeing, and did I intend that? Was that on purpose? And I was like, some things are just revealed in the making. It really is. You can have all these plans, but until you see it, especially with the three-dimensional pieces, you're not going to know how those relate to each other until you see it in actual 3 dimensions. So those kind of rewards that come along the way are very exciting for me to continue to have that revelation and excitement and reward. Because, there's things that I do that it's like, meh, I go up, I pull a print, and it's
Par
like,
for the course.
Sure. but I can always over dye that,
Sure.
or I mean, I save everything,
Yeah.
and sometimes there's little scraps of fabric that'll be in something that I made 10 years ago. I dyed 10 years ago, and it just didn't fit into whatever piece I was doing then until.
And that's what your reference books are for, that you might be able to then pull in one other aspect just to give it
Exactly.
its personality.
Right.
Yeah.
And there's so much that's important about contrast in um, a lot of different ways. I'm working with contrast. I'm working with contrasts of materials. Is it reflective or is it matte? Is it a velvet that draws you in and gives you really a depth of color, or is it something that's lighter? I'm trying to create these. I think I think of myself primarily as a sculptor,
Sure.
and but I have been doing more and more work in 2 dimensions for the wall. In the last few years. And so there's always, for me, this desire to create a 2 dimensional object that feels 3 dimensional, that it has a sense of objectness beyond. Um, a painter can do that with paint.
Yeah.
A painter can draw or paint a picture of something.
Yeah.
They're painting, or maybe it is abstract, but it's like, oh, it needs a little more dark. They can paint a darker color there. Well, I'm not really doing that. I'm having to make those choices of value, of pattern. It's more like a collage than it is a painting. And so part of how I want things to feel 3 dimensional and draw you in, I'm doing a lot of that with texture
Right.
of fabrics and also with value.
A little bit of the action that you brought to the 2 dimensional pieces, but then with 3 dimensional, you can accentuate not only because of that line of the edge, as your friend mentioned, but extra to that, in both the 3 dimensional work and the 2 dimensional work, you have a lot of embroidery that you run by hand. So it's not a
Right.
pre-programmed pattern.
Oh, no,
it's
no.
something that you are reacting to and inviting into the image
Yes,
as you stitch.
for sure.
Well, electronically, I guess.
Well,
with
I'm using a machine,
right?
right? But
But that it's your stitch.
oh, for sure.
Right.
And it's almost like the stitch has it has a hand of its own. It has the line quality, I think, of my stitching is equivalent in some ways to a drawn line that an artist might use. There are things that I tend to do that have become almost like handwriting. Like my handwriting is distinctive and your handwriting
Yes.
is distinctive. And I think that my stitched line has a sense of that, as well as another artist who does drawing or painting has as well. But the stitching is definitely a big part of it, and it is the last part of the process. So that I do. But everything is machine stitched. It's called free motion embroidery, and I am literally drawing with the stitching.
Right.
And and in some areas it's very restrained, and in some areas it's dense, and it just depends on the piece. The piece kind of tells me what it needs.
And then is that also part of an echoing of the concepts that you're exploring too? Do you find yourself imposing and reacting to the fern shape with intention for a message, so that you're tightening up the image, you're putting more lines in to create tension, or
Yeah, I think that in some of the works in the show that are more subtle in their coloration, they're mostly white. I'm using basically white thread as well to create a pattern where maybe there isn't a visual pattern, or to emphasize what may be very subtle. In other places, I'm densely, and it depends on the piece. Like on these patterns that have a crackle that's created by using a flower paste resist, I can emphasize that crackle. I can emphasize that, and I think of that as almost like a fossil, or something that is older or is being revealed. I can emphasize that, as the piece that's behind you, there's a rubbing from a tree stump that's on our property, and
Yes.
that I have densely stitched by going in on basically every ring of the tree and stitching that line. So it's used. It does reinforce, I think, the ideas and the feel of the piece. It can strengthen an image that feels subtle, and it can emphasize, again, it's that contrast. Maybe I have some areas that are densely stitched next to areas that are more open.
Sure.
Hmm.
So you use all sorts of techniques.
I do.
Some very well established, hundreds of years. I
Mhm.
guess shibori would be one of those,
For
and
sure.
obviously an immersion dyeing would be beginnings of everything, or
Yes.
something to that effect. Uh, there's monotyping. We've mentioned the embroidery. Uh, and I know that you are going to delve into some of these techniques in a moment. But what do you think it's leading towards? What's your next phase? What is it you think that this body of work has created a jumping off point?
Well, see, now there's a quick trick question.
Yeah.
I don't really know what's next. I mean, I think for so many of us, we don't know what's next.
Nope.
Um, we're just kind of going by. I know that I am really looking forward to delving more deeply into my property and doing some more gardening. We have it's very overgrown, but has these beautiful bones to it. And I want
Marvelous.
to shepherd that land and that gardening and create spaces for living within that, which has been maybe less tended than and but as far as in the studio, I need to kind of have some time to not be busy. I always need a break in between one body of work and the next. I do still have a few pieces that are on the drawing board that didn't quite make it into this show, that are ready to go. And so I'll probably finish those up. But I always feel like I need each body of work, and basically it's evolved to be each solo show that I have here has kind of been its own concept, its own beginning, middle, and end. And I'm not sure what the beginning of the next body of work is yet. I just
Right.
think I need to sit with that for a while.
Well, maybe creating those outdoor spaces are going to just branch right into.
You never know. And I get so much of my inspiration from just being in nature and taking photos, and also from travel, which we're not doing these days.
Sure.
This summer we did do, instead of traveling all over the world, we traveled close to home.
Yes.
And spent a lot more time camping and just exploring Washington State.
There's lots to see.
There's
isn't
so
there?
much to see, and I feel like we've just barely scratched the surface.
Yeah.
So a lot of times that inspiration comes from just being out in nature and finding those moments with my camera
Right.
that I can document, and that when I come back to the studio, I look at those again, and those help me to know what's next. And who knows, maybe I'll find some new technique that I haven't done before, or get back into something that I haven't done before, or have done. And there are processes that I use regularly, and then things that are new or that I come back to. And that exploration in the dye studio is definitely one of the muses for my work.
Sure.
Is creating that, and having that open space and open time to not be structured often is what leads me down into the next body of work, the next
Well, I
concept.
hope you'll give us a little more insight into this ice dyeing, and what was it? Color magic.
Oh,
magnet.
Our color magnet. Yes, the
Yeah.
color magnet, a dye attractant.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I don't have a video about that one, but I can. Oh, I do have some videos. I've been taking little videos at home.
Sure.
throughout the pandemic. It's, you know, it's such a strangely isolating time, and having these little videos that I've been doing at home, just setting up my little tripod with a camera, which is my phone, and then being able to put those on social media like Instagram or Facebook, and um, and then people comment, and you just feel like, oh my gosh, there's someone actually out there.
Yeah, a
I'm not
little
so alone.
collaboration and a little, yeah,
Yeah, and so
community.
it is really nice to feel
Mhm.
that.
Yeah.
It means a lot, um, because it is, otherwise it's very isolating these
Right.
days. And you know, we live at home. I work at home. My husband's working at home. Our children are off living their own lives, and it is nice to feel a connection.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah. So, should I'm going to move over and talk about some of these other works. And
Enjoy.
thank you. I'm going to come over here. Whoops. Dragging my cord as I go. Hi again. Okay. So here I have some of these three-dimensional pieces that we've been talking about, that Fen and I have been talking about. And I want to say thank you to Fen for that, spending that time together. She's been such a huge support um, of me as an artist and here at the gallery. Um, but so I work both in 2 and 3 dimensions, and I'm using the same dyed fabrics in both. And there's often questions about how are these pieces made, because they are unusual. And actually, in so many ways, they're really not made very much differently than the two-dimensional pieces. And part of that is what I'm using for structure. And so underneath all of these fabrics is this, it's just a non-woven interfacing that's got a stiffness to it, as you can see, but it also will hold a form. And each of these pieces are using this, it's just the white stuff on the back. And what this is it's a card. I make a card for each of the pieces, that I put the sample fabrics that I'm going to be using on those pieces, so that I can test out thread colors and things like that, so that I can get a sense of how is that going to work without actually sewing on the final artwork until I'm ready. I've made those decisions. So these are kind of my little test pieces, but they are, as you can see, it holds a curve, but it has a stiffness to it. So this is what is inside these. And in some places it's multi-layer, so it might be a little bit stiffer. So this piece, it's called Innis Arden. This has multiple different fabrics on it. This piece here is actually using the color attractant, the color magnet that Fen was talking about. And what it is it's a product that I buy from a dye supplier that is it's kind of like a paste. And I actually took this piece of fabric and pinned it up to a tree. And Dan actually has a little video of me doing that with dye rather than the color attractant, but it's the same sort of idea. So I'm out there, just got this fabric tacked, it's still white, and I've just got it tacked up to my cedar trees, and those topped cedar trees in the front yard. And I'm painting on with a thickened dye. But if that was the color magnet, it would be it'd be yellow. So that doesn't make that much difference, but I can see it. And then what happens is when I dye this fabric, if I put it in the dye bath, where that color attractant is, where it's picked up the texture of the tree, it grabs the dye more. So it is a darker pattern on a lighter background. So I've done that here with the tree bark. I've done it with stumps and materials as well, but I don't know that those ended up in the show here. in the center here is a piece of velvet that's actually I used rust to dye. So I just placed the fabric onto a rusty object and the rust color transfers to the dye, to the fabric. And then this piece on the side is more of that ice dyeing. So it does change from top to bottom, and you can see that where the folds were as I folded it to get patterning. And on the back or on the other side of this piece is a print of the blackberry. So I'm using multiple different fabrics within each piece. And it actually, because they're forms and they're open, there's an inside and an outside. So it gives me a chance to have each of these panels is backed on both sides. And what you can see through from this opening is actually the other side of the stitching. So the stitching is embellishes the piece, but it also helps it form together. It helps hold the whole thing together. So it's not only a adding color and texture, but it's also integral to the piece itself because it helps it form together, stay together. Here's another piece. This has a print of the blackberry here, and then some. This is a flower paste resist, and then the back of this here. And Dan, I think we can show this batik video. This back piece, I folded the fabrics and then dipped the edges into wax. And in the video here, you'll see me unfolding this after I've dipped it in wax and then dyed it overnight. And as I unfold the piece, I'm really seeing it for the first time. So it's always an exciting moment. It's that Christmas moment where you get to unwrap the presents and see what's in there. So it has a stiffness there because of the wax adds stiffness, but the wax that I use is a soy-based wax. And so with lots of hot water and detergent, I'm able to wash that wax out of the fabric, unlike more traditional waxes. So it's actually a way more eco-friendly method than traditional waxes that would have to be boiled or dry cleaned to get the residual wax out. Okay, perfect. So I'm going to talk a little bit about these two pieces. So these two pieces are, they're related in that they are both prints, and this was the first print, and this is the second print from the same setup. And actually, Dan, we can show that print video too, which will give you an idea of how I do this. There we go. So here you can see me brushing thickened dye down on the surface, on my print surface. And then I use, here's the blackberry, to put that on top and cover that with the fabric. Now, because the fabric is flexible, I don't need to use a press for this. I can actually use my hands as a press. So I put it on there, I'm smoothing the fabric out, and it is picking up that dye from underneath. So I'm making the pattern there, and I'm using my fingers to kind of work around all the little nooks and crannies. And here's the print number 1. That's a positive, what I call the positive. Now I'm taking off those blackberry leaves, and what it leaves there is what would be a ghost print in a more traditional printing technology terminology. I'm using a little water there to help release that, help wet the fabric a little bit, not too much or it'll get blurry, but it helps that dye release onto the fabric. So that's my print number 2. Now here I'm going to actually take a third print, because when those blackberry leaves were face down on that print, they got the dye on them. So here is my print number 3, and I'm placing that over the leaves, and again putting a little bit of water there to just release that imagery. And also from the back, there's still actually a fair amount of color left, even for a third print on that printing surface. And so here is that third print. And this print is actually in the show here. So not this one here behind me. So these two, the unmade bed and the uninvited guest, are plays on those ideas of blackberry. It's it's in our gardens. It would take over if we don't get rid of it. But so it is the uninvited guest, but it gives us, we get those berries, we get the habitat for birds, there's food for animals in that as well. And then the unmade bed. This is a raw silk here, and this is a crepe de chine. And I actually really love this print. It has this softness from the water in there that gives it almost a watercolory feel. But then there's these areas of really detailed from the leaves. And it being on this crepe de chine and that silk would be normally a fabric that might be used in lingerie or very fine silk. It's got a beautiful drape and hand to it. And so it does have that sense of sensuality to me in this particular choice of materials for this particular piece. Okay, then Dan, can you untangle these, or Robin, thank you. My mic cord is tangled up. That's okay. And this is how you know it's live. And so this piece here is working with the ferns, and this is I believe the last process I was going to talk about, and this is working with a flower paste resist. And so it really is in some ways like making pancakes. I just mix up a mixture of flour and water to create a paste, and we have a video as well, and it might actually be making this particular piece of fabric now that I think about it. Here is I'm just literally pouring this paste on top. I'm using a scraper to move it around the shape. So once that I take the fern off after the flower is all on there, it leaves space. I let that dry overnight or for a couple of days, and sometimes it takes that long. And then as it dries, the flour paste will crack, and as the water evaporates, and it creates this very distinctive crackle pattern, which I help along by crunching it up with my hands as well. And then I'm able to put a thickened dye over the top. So what you're seeing is created basically by the space that's left around with the flour paste around it. So it's a negative shape that gets filled in there by the dye. So the fern itself is actually a resist that I'm putting the flour paste around. And then there's a crackle pattern that was revealed as well and is emphasized by stitch here. Now, I think that's all our videos. Is that right, Dan? So we're good on that. And we could move into a question if there are any. I'd be happy to hear those.
Kept rooms warm. Your pieces feel very warm, and I'm wondering if you actively think of your textiles in relationship with that history, or maybe that textile history. Just curious.
So I'm sorry, can you repeat the first part? Yeah, well, I think that a big part of fabric is that we buy fabric from birth to death. It's the first thing that touches our skin, and we are touching fabric all day, every day. It keeps us warm, it keeps us protected, it keeps us safe, and it also gives us a chance to show our style. We use clothing as a way to express ourselves, and I think that there is that inherent feeling of protection and warmth, and like I was talking about with the silk and how it has been used as for like lingerie or for those kind of fine silks. I think that there's a real difference in how we interact with a fine silk versus a burlap or something. It's the material itself has a materiality that we respond to as humans, and it's very difficult to. Everyone wants to interact with these pieces. I mean, I do too. When I go see a fiber art show, I have to, hold my hands behind my back because I want to touch things. And I think that there is a very compelling feeling about work with fabric because of that. I had one other point. Oh, I wanted to think. So some of the fabrics that I'm used in the show are actually I bought at a rummage sale that were house linens, so tablecloths or linen napkins, and then I dyed those. And I really love the idea that those particular individual pieces of fabric hold their own memories of parties that they were at, or where guests were, wiping their mouths and their lips, interacting very specifically with those pieces of fabric that now have a new life after sitting in a drawer for years and not being, and whatever family deciding that they didn't need. I may.
From Carol Milne, when you pair your piece, how do you decide what goes together? Is it purely a visual combination, or is there a deeper layer of thought involved?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think it's both. A lot of it is a visual, what does this piece need? I was talking about that a little bit with Fen. Does it need something, a darker value? Does it need a contrasting texture or color? Or what am I going to introduce into this that makes this piece sing? And a lot of times that is really about color and texture. But I do have an attachment to individual pieces of fabric. And sometimes I dye something and it's just like a little shining star in that particular piece. And I mean, I would say that's really all the pieces that you're seeing here in this show have that star quality to me. Otherwise they wouldn't be here. There are a lot of pieces that they're, maybe they need a little work or something. It's really a series of editing. Everything really becomes about editing. I start out with piles of fabric, but what rises to the top is what you see in the show.
Nice, thank you. Carol Milne has one more question here. Do you approach your 3D constructions differently than your 2D pieces?
I do. It may sound crazy to people, but in some ways the 3-dimensional pieces are easier for me to make than the 2-dimensional pieces. And I think that's because of that feeling of creating that objectness, of creating, it's just easier if it's easier for an actually 3-dimensional object to appear 3-dimensional than a 2-dimensional object to appear 3-dimensional. So there's kind of more there in a 3-dimensional object than there is in a 2-dimensional object. I feel like the 2-dimensional objects, I have to work harder to have them be finished and complete than I do in a 3-dimensional object. And that may be because of just my mindset of where I start. It may be that a person who starts working more with 2 dimensions, like a painter or a printmaker, would find that transition to 3 dimensions more difficult. But because I think I started 2 dimensions more difficult. So they're different processes, really.
Nice. There's one from Joe Crow here. This is the last question on the text here. You answered a lot of this question already, but just to go ahead and ask again, is the fabric cotton or silk? So you have different pieces that you use.
Yeah, so there's all of those. I use all natural wool. The dyes that I work with will work on any cellulose fabric. So that is any one that grows from plants, like cotton, linen, rayon actually comes from a tree fiber, silk, and then silk is its own kind of hybrid. Silk is like it doesn't know whether it wants to be a protein fiber or a cellulose fiber, but it will work. It works with the dyes that I use, which are a Procyon MX dyes, and I use primarily an alkaline fixative. And so I'm using those fabrics. I can't use any synthetics, and I don't use wool. It doesn't dye with the fabrics with the dyes that I use because it's a protein. It's only a protein fiber. So it's really a combination of all different things. And again, like the velvets that I use are a rayon silk velvet, so they're a blend. I've got some fabrics in here that also have a bamboo and cotton mixture. I haven't used much hemp, but I could. But there's a lot of different kinds of cottons. There's more Kona cottons and quilting cottons, and then there's some sand washed, mercerized. I can go on broadcloth, and I am also using a lot of different silks. But so it's really a combination. They all have different qualities and textures and amounts of reflecting to absorbing light.
Lovely. You have another question that came here from Vita Weniker. Have you found new ways of creating as you've moved into a new studio space beyond the new dyeing printing techniques you talked about?
Well, I think it's interesting. I feel like in some ways I'm still learning to work in my new studio, in that it's smaller than my previous studios and more kind of concentrated. And before I had a home studio where I would do my sewing, and I also had a washing area. And then I had an outside studio that I was able to really just do more, not hands-on, but more the dyeing. One of the things that has really changed as far as how I work in the home studio is that I have a printer there. And I could have had a printer in my other studio, but I never realized how useful it would be. And there's a lot of things that I've done that using just the simple inkjet printer has simplified in my process. And actually, I'm going to grab a little prop real quick and be right back. So this is a tiny little paper maquette of the piece that's over there. And what I'm able to do, which I could never do before, is to actually print out in paper the panels that I'm using. And then I'm just using Scotch tape here to kind of put it together. So what I can do is actually see what that's going to look like, very small, without having to make the piece first. So it just using a printer has kind of simplified my process, and that's something that I've learned and is new on working at home instead of working in a separate studio.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for those questions. And here comes Fen. Got to sanitize the mics here in between.
Thank you, Cameron.
Oh, thank you, Fen.
Thank you all for joining us. We invite you to come see Cameron Ann Mason's exhibition at the gallery. We're here Tuesday through Saturday, 10 a.m. until 6 p.m. But you can also visit the exhibition online at fosterwhite.com. Special thanks goes out to Daniel Thornton of Underwood Live for filming and for hosting this extravaganza. Dan is an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker and television director. His work can be seen on PBS, BBC, CBC, and other streaming platforms. Thanks again.
Oh, thank you. And thank you to the gallery for believing in me.
A pleasure.
And bringing me on 10 years ago. I still pinch myself to be represented here. It's been a wonderful relationship. And also special thanks to Dan and to Robin for helping out. Really made a huge difference in these times of being able to bring you here to the gallery to see the work. And we're all just figuring this out as we go along. So thank you for coming.
Thank you for your questions. Thank you for watching, and be well.